My name is Patrick Cook. I'm Executive Director of Public Affairs here at the college. I work in the President's Office. President Cowan asked me to welcome everybody here today. She's coming on our Bedford campus. We're very pleased to have, this is our fourth in a series of debates that we've been hosting this summer in partnership with some of our media partners from throughout the area, at the Lowell Sun, at the Salem News, and today we're being joined by the Fitchburg Sentinel and Enterprise. And for those who don't know, who are new to this city or new to this this building specifically, this building was built in 1931. It used to house the United States Post Office. It also housed the congressional offices for Edith Nourse Rogers, who was the longest standing woman in Congress. It was also the home of Paul Tsongas' first congressional office. It served as an office for Veterans Affairs for decades, as well as immigration hearings, which were held up on the third floor here. We acquired the building in 1996 and opened it in 2004. It now houses our library as well as classrooms, and it's a community meeting space for events like this. So we're glad to have everybody here, especially if you're new to the city. Welcome. Hope we can take a walk downtown and navigate some of the new two-way streets that have opened up over the weekend. But I'm very proud to bring up the gentleman who's going to be moderating today's debate, keeping an eye on the clock, keeping the debaters in line, and keeping, more importantly, the questioners in line. They can be an unruly bunch over there. So I want to welcome Charlie St. Amand, the editor of the Fitchburg Sentinel and Enterprise. Charlie?
Thank you, Patrick. We're very pleased, obviously, to be partnering not only with Middlesex Community College, but also with the Sun on this debate. Let me introduce, first of all, the candidates. On your left is Evan Falchuk of the United Independent Party, and to his left is independent candidate Jeff McCormick. Our panel members who will be asking the questions today are from your left, from your right. Chris Camere, City Editor of the Sentinel and Enterprise. Maria Kuna, Associate Dean of Middlesex Community College's Lowell campus. And Tom Zupa, Managing Editor of The Sun. Our rules are simple. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer a question, followed by 30 seconds of rebuttal and interplay between the candidates. As moderator, I will reserve the right to ask a follow-up question and allow candidates to go longer during a rebuttal if they are on a topic that warrants extra time. And if I know the panel well, there will be opportunities for that. They're going to ask good questions. I ask the audience to hold your applause until the closing statements so we can keep things moving along, but don't hold your tweets. Please go ahead and tweet hashtag MAGov or hashtag MAPoly, and we're doing live coverage both on sentinelenterprise.com and on lowellsun.com. So please join the conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to stand so that the candidates can lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Before the debate, we decided that the candidates decided amongst themselves that Mr. Falchuk would take the first question, and asking the first question will be Chris Camere.
Thank you. The economy in certain parts of Massachusetts has not rebounded like it has in Metro Boston. The jobless rate in the Leominster-Fitchburg-Gardner area, where our newspaper publishes, is more than 2 points higher than the state average. I'd like to know what your plan is to bring the types of businesses that will create more than a handful of jobs to the pockets of the state that are still hurting.
Thanks, Chris. It's a good question. We've laid out in my campaign a very detailed set of plans about how we can actually drive business growth in Massachusetts. The biggest barrier to business growth today is the cost of living in Massachusetts. This affects businesses and families in different parts of the state in different ways. But the biggest drivers of this are the monopolistic consolidation of hospitals into giant systems that's making our healthcare far too expensive, and a lack of any comprehensive housing production policy, which affects every community across our Commonwealth. There's lots of economic research that shows that the way to kickstart economic growth, job creation, is by kickstarting housing production. But we have no fundamental plans to do it. What we've laid out on my campaign is a plan called the Thriving Communities Action Plan, which you can find at the falchuk2014.org website. It is as thorough as you can get around the pieces that need to be put in place to make sure that communities are able to build housing. And what it comes down to is supporting education. If you can go to a city like Fitchburg, where Mayor Lisa Wong has pointed out that funding education is crucial to the success, the future success of that community. And then you realize that it isn't just about making sure that kids get a good education, which we have an obligation to do, but to see the fact that state aid for education, which has been cut over the last decade, and the ability of cities and towns to allow for more housing to be built are inextricably linked. You realize that our failure at the state level to do this is what holds us back. So we have to do this. It requires leadership and a vision, and for all candidates, the ability to lay out very specifically what it is that they plan to do to make these things happen.
Thank you, Mr. Falchuk. Mr. McCormick.
One of the things I've been doing for the last 27 years of my life is building companies and creating jobs. And my campaign essentially is Jeff for Jobs. I do believe so much of what we need to do is ultimately about job growth. It is a job that pulls people out of poverty. And in my campaign, having built jobs from small companies, which create about 80% of the new jobs, we look at the small companies and say, what are the impediments to growth? One of the major impediments, as Evan just pointed out, is the cost of healthcare. It's a huge issue with small companies. Another one is the cost of energy. We're fifth highest energy cost in the United States. That's very, very difficult for manufacturing companies. One of the other things that we need to do is simplify our regulations to make it easier for small companies essentially to get birthed and then to grow. And when you spend an entire career dealing with these kinds of issues, again, you know exactly where you need to go to fix them.
So do I get to now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this is the problem, is that how is now the question. How do you go about doing those things? So and I'm a business person. I was the president of a business that we grew from 9 employees to 600 employees over the course of about 12 years. The challenges we faced in Massachusetts was that it was very expensive to hire workers here. And that's because the cost of living is so high. And that's because of the monopolistic consolidation of hospitals and because of a lack of comprehensive policy around housing. Now, we laid out specific plans for that. One of the distinctions you see between Jeff's campaign and mine is that I hear the nice, and it's not just Jeff, this is what we hear from the establishment generally, are the nice vague platitudes about these issues, but not the specific, okay, how? How do we do this?
Okay, so would you like
Sure.
me to say exactly how? Okay, energy, actually, not just how are we doing it, how am I doing it? So we have a company right now that comes in and cuts hospitals, colleges, universities, industrial companies, cuts our energy bill down by about 30% by trucking in natural gas. That is a solution. It's not, and the good news is, it's not something that takes a lot of lawyers and cutting pipelines through tons of towns and all the resistance. We're doing it. That's a solution. Education, a solution. You want one right now? I'll give you one right now. We teach millions of kids math, 41 different states throughout the country. It is a solution. That is the #1 reason why young men of color drop out of high school, is struggling in math. So we didn't even put a Band-Aid solution. We went back to the root of the problem. That is very specific. Healthcare, the exact model that I think works the best, team-based medicine, emphasizing primary care. When you have physicians and you have nurses working together with case managers, looking at the whole person. It's being done in the private sector. Again, it's being done today. It's not like we need a new technology. That's exactly how, and that saves money in the long term.
Okay, thank you, candidates. Let's move on. Maria Kuna.
Thank you. And my question is going to...
It's going to me.
It's going to you. Okay. Mr. McCormick, working with young people here at Middlesex Community College, I know the importance of education to one's success. Unfortunately, thousands of young men and women graduate from our high schools but are unable to attend or afford college because of their immigration status. Even though this has been debated by the legislature during a number of sessions, if elected, what would you do to make this a reality for the hundreds of undocumented youth graduating from high school?
Well, I personally believe that in any society, the more educated your society is, the better off it will be. more educated people tend to be the job creators. And if indeed we're trying to create jobs, what you want is people to be as far advanced along as possible. So it makes perfect sense to me, and remembering, especially in community colleges, state colleges, and universities, the vast majority of these students are going to stay and live in our state. So I do think that they ought to be afforded the rights of other people here. And I very much believe in in-state tuition.
People with the status you've described should get in-state tuition. They should also have driver's licenses. They should be treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve. You know, I speak Spanish. My father came here from Venezuela. I've been appalled at the way we've been talking about immigration, even in this election. Jeff has taken some positions that I find distressing around the issue of the migrant children. For cheap political gain, to be talking about these kids who have a need under a law signed by President Bush to get a hearing before we decide what their status is. And the federal government saying, look, we're overwhelmed, we need a place for kids to stay. And the governor, to his credit, said, look, if you want to house them on some of our military bases, you can. But what Jeff put out there was a lot of stuff about how they were going to be in our communities and how it was wrong. And you saw the rallies. There was a rally in front of the State House where people were chanting all sorts of what I would view as anti-Hispanic chants. And you see that, you're like, this is happening in Massachusetts. And you know why it happens? Is because we don't have leaders who are saying there is the right thing and there is the wrong thing. And using children, and especially migrant children in these kinds of situations for cheap political gain and for lots of likes on Facebook, and actually in the case, Jeff, of your Facebook page, you ask people to donate money on that basis, is unworthy of the people of Massachusetts.
Well, this is something that, it's very interesting how Evan is twisting a rally that I had, by the way, nothing to do with. I took the position that we need to think about our resources, because we live in a commonwealth that our resources are constrained. And we need to look at where are we going to get the resources. And I've traveled throughout the state, and I've talked to school committees and how stretched their budgets are. And I've talked to mayors and city councils and people who are saying, we're just, you know, there is so much need out there. And I give money to homeless veterans on my way walking to work. And by the way, I support a ton of organizations with my wife. And this was such an orchestrated, politicized event, if you will. And remember how quickly it went when they realized, oh gee, there is real pain out there that we're not addressing. And there are a lot of people who work for wonderful provider organizations that were absolutely stressed that they're not getting the resources to do the work they're trying to do, and yet we're willing to take on other multi-billion-dollar issues. That was the problem. This wasn't about trying to do something that was some orchestrated, politicized event. I mean, give me a break.
Jeff, you willfully chose not to be aware of what it was that was going on with this policy. It was never going to be the cities and towns paying for this. This was the federal government. Never. They were going to be on military bases. And leaders should be able to go to people and explain to people what's really going on rather than use confusion for cheap political gain. It's not leadership. It just isn't. And people will take advantage of it because there's plenty of people who are inherently bigoted in some way, who love to take advantage of situations like this to hold rallies like that. Leaders should be the people that go to people and calmly explain to them, listen, there was a law signed by President Bush that said that migrant children unaccompanied need to have hearings. And there was an overwhelming number of them that showed up at the border. And to comply with the law, we need to be able to ensure that they get those hearings. That should be the beginning and the end of it. Now, it was unfortunate that Governor Patrick decided to compare it to people escaping from the Holocaust. That didn't help. But I'll tell you what really inflamed things were things like what you posted over and over again on your Facebook, the statements you put out there, talking about these migrant children and saying, and look, I know you had said you would adopt a couple of them. I mean, it is one of these things from the standpoint of the morality of the issue, we should be able to look to leaders and say, they're going to level with us, they're going to tell us what the deal is, and they're not going to play games with children's lives.
Okay, brief, Mr. McCrory, if you have a brief reply to that.
Yeah,
Just very brief.
Again, the spirit of everything I've done and all the giving, and you look at the needs we have around here, I think you're the one who's actually turning this into a bit of a political football.
Hey Jeff,
And
I got to call you on this because the whole situation is bigoted, frankly. And I'm not saying you're a bigot, but the way that people have gone after migrant children that are Hispanic has to be called. And I'm not using it for political gain. I'm talking about this as a human being, as a voter, as an American who sees people being mistreated by people in politics. And you're using it for political gain when you post Facebook after Facebook after Facebook and saying how you've got 700 likes and please give $5 to help support the cause. And willfully, as you're doing now, being ignorant of what it is that was actually going on and what the policy was. So what I'm doing is just doing what not enough people do in politics, is calling it for what it is. It's just, this is what it is. You're using it for that purpose.
Okay, we're going to move on. Tom Zupa.
Hey, good afternoon. Question for Mr. Falchuk. We keep seeing increasing numbers of incidents and crimes and police actions involving those with mental health issues. What do you think of the state's mental health policies and infrastructure today, and how would you change that?
It's tragic what goes on, and for a number of reasons. There's both the stigma of mental health, which makes it more difficult for people to seek out that kind of care, and there's a lack of funding. There's not appropriate funding for these things. I think that's very clear. When you think about mental health, the Department of Mental Health during Governor Patrick's administration is down 1,000 workers. Now, we have a government that likes to talk about how it prioritizes the issue of mental health. We don't see that in the actions that it's taking. So we have to consider mental health as any other health issue. Any other health issue. I come from the healthcare business. There's a whole person, and they've got all sorts of other things going on. For some reason, for historical reasons, people view mental health as not being connected to a person's physical health and well-being, and it needs to change. So from a leadership perspective, you need people in government that are comfortable talking about issues of mental health, that want to lead around the issue of making sure we've got sufficient resources available to deal with it, and are willing to call out the establishment for its failure to live up to those promises. I was struck how in this last legislative session, the legislature agreed last week or so to fund $1 billion to expand the convention center in Boston. $1 billion. Now, we hear from so many people that are advocates for lots of causes, including in mental health, saying that they're told by people in the legislature there isn't money for things, but there's money to build out a convention center. The reason I'm running, and the reason I founded a new party, is we need a comprehensive change to our system today, because it doesn't represent people. It's tied into representing moneyed interests and doing favors for those folks so that you can keep those jobs. It's wrong, and it's what has to change.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick?
Yeah, mental health is real disease, and for too long we've been treating it as something else. And what we need to do is, in fact, treat the whole person. And what we've found, and there are studies out there, that if we stop the resistance to mental health treatment, I've heard people joke it's easier to get someone into an Ivy League school than it is to get an insurance company to pay for their mental health. You know, that's kind of a sad joke. We will save so much money with the better outcomes for that individual that it essentially pays for itself. But we've gone so far in this healthcare system on resisting it that, you know, that we basically have to reinvent it and take a big step back. So I think the benefits are absolutely there, just like they are with areas like incarceration reform. The savings are there to society, and it's the right thing to do.
We have another 30
Sure.
seconds here to keep going. So one of the other things to add is, for when you think about education, we in many ways have an educational system that not only is it underfunded, but it needs to be funded differently, because there are communities, especially ones that are heavily Black and Latino, that are facing issues of mental health at rates that are far higher than communities where people look like me. So when a kid is in school and they're challenged with the things they need to do well on a standardized test, but they're suffering from PTSD because they're growing up in a neighborhood that's been beset by violence, or if they've lost a family member or friend or just someone they know to a murder or in some kind of violent act, that requires resources to be able to do it. So again, we have an establishment that likes to say that education of each child is paramount and everyone needs to be treated equally. But I believe today in America, we still are not living up to that promise. And the fact that we're not doing it here in Massachusetts makes it incumbent upon all of us to not just ask the question as to why, but to take action to turn it into a reality.
Okay, that completes round one. Let's go to round two. Chris Camille.
As I'm sure you are aware, it is rare for a third party or independent candidate to perform well in a Massachusetts election. Given that, why should voters consider casting a vote for an independent candidate when the odds are so heavily stacked against you?
When you think about who the past independent candidates have been, I would argue that they're not the strongest candidates, partly because of where they came from and some of the ways they became an independent, if you will. The reason why I'm running as an independent is to do a job. I want to be free of the special interests. I want to be free of the status quo. I want to take a skill set that I've acquired over 27 years of building companies, of solving problems, of creating jobs, which again, as I said, I think is of paramount importance. Having worked in areas like healthcare, energy, education, biotechnology, software, areas that are very, very important to this Commonwealth, and understanding how to get to the root of the problem, like I mentioned with that math software company. You see kids are going to jail, why? They drop out of high school, why? They struggle in math, how do you try and fix that? So that for very, very cheap dollars, they have significantly increased math scores. That's the kind of governor we need. And you have to be bold. And by the way, in my life, you have to take risk. And when you come from nothing, it's frankly, you're just comfortable being out on the edge all the time. Also, as an independent, it is easier to govern because you're not spending all your time raising money for your party or trying to get this rep elected or that senator elected. You're able to make the best decision for everyone in the Commonwealth and do the right thing. That's why I'm running.
We live in a very challenging time in America today. People have lost confidence in the institutions that we've been in history able to look to and say they're able to deal with our issues. In Massachusetts, the majority of voters aren't enrolled in one of the parties anymore. In the last statewide election, only 27% of voters voted. In this election, a majority of our legislators are running unopposed. These are symptoms of a political process that is not functioning very well. And when we talk about the issues that aren't dealt with, that are important issues that matter to every single person in the Commonwealth that aren't dealt with, it's because of our broken political system. What has happened and what is needed is a new framework. Yes, I'm an independent, but I also founded a new party because that must happen. We need a new framework that's not tied into the same special interests that have gotten us where we are today, where people who will talk like I do about these issues are the ones who will be filling our legislature, one way or the other. Voters should look at every election as two things. One of them is a job interview. Each person is here, they're asking you to hire them for an important job. And you've got to be able to look at that person and say, are they for real? Is this the kind of person I want? Are they leveling with me? Are they telling me what was really going on? And the other thing is to realize that each of us has the responsibility and the power to take action to vote. And it is the responsibility of each candidate to earn that vote from you. There are voters and there are people that will tell you that a candidate who is an independent is taking votes from one party or another. Well, I don't buy into that. And I don't think voters should either. Just because you're in a demographic doesn't mean you're supposed to vote for a particular candidate. Make them earn it.
Any rebuttal, or can we move on to the next question?
Please.
Okay, we'll go right to Maria Kuna.
So the next question is, in a recent report about the working poor living in the Commonwealth, stated that 1 in 5 workers in the state, most over the age of 26, make less than $12 an hour and face many difficulties. What initiatives do you support or propose to help the many families in our Commonwealth that are struggling to pay their rent, buy their food, and care for their families?
Those statistics, and many like them, are just, they are so appalling. I mean, I say that Massachusetts, we should be thinking of it as each of our neighborhood, but it's not. It's not one neighborhood. The disparities that you're talking about here happen not just urban, suburban. Many of these things are Black, Latino, white issues, and we have to recognize that reality. What we laid out in my campaign with both the fundamental plan to lower the cost of living in Massachusetts will help so many people be able to make that money go further, but we need to do so much more because education is not properly funded by the state. Job training programs in this last legislative session, tens of millions of dollars would have made a huge difference, and in our budget that's a tiny fraction of the total budget, but it wasn't funded. For example, state college fees were kept flat, but community college fees were not. the disparity is there. And the people that are going to those community colleges are the ones who most need that help. I'm not saying the ones at the state colleges don't too, because they do. But the priorities are out of whack. We need leadership that is willing to confront those issues head on, describe them for what they are, and to make sure we're directing resources to help each and every one of those communities. I like to think of it as build from the inside out, rather than trying to figure out how can we give out a giant tax break to a big company to lure it to Massachusetts. Help a family get a leg up and move forward.
Mr. McCormick?
When you look at this issue as it relates to gateway cities in particular, what bothers me is that there's all this talk about strategies of creating jobs in these communities, and then they come out with, in this past budget, $16 million for a development fund. There's 26 gateway communities. It just isn't enough to jumpstart the kind of job growth that you need, which starts to pull up the wages. So to me, that's a significant problem. Another thing that I can't stand when I travel throughout the Commonwealth and I meet with various provider organizations are these kind of cliff benefit programs where once you make a certain amount, you just lose, you get cut off of certain benefits. And to me, it's not a situation that you go from extremely struggling to being prosperous. I mean, it comes in steps. So to me, on these benefit programs, we ought to structure them recognizing that we should always be trying to pull people up to the next level, wherever that is. And yes, at some point, they're not going to need assistance. They're not going to need help from the state or any of these organizations. But until then, don't just cut them off at the knees. Because in a very perverse sense, we sometimes create disincentives for people to be successful. And to me, that's just not smart.
What would you use, 16 million isn't enough, what would you commit to the gateway cities and how would you pay for it? Where would you come up with the money?
Well, as far as coming up with the money, there's a lot of different programs, and I know Evan laughs at me for this, converting garbage to gasoline, because it generates hundreds of millions of dollars. You know, the technology's there, things like that just make sense to me. Certainly there's, again, using compressed natural gas, you can structure things in partnerships with the state, that the state has significant revenues for doing that. Incarceration reform, again, I believe will have very significant savings. Instead of building $1 billion worth of jails, you know, let's talk to our sheriffs, and because they'll tell you too many people are in jail. They shouldn't be there. As far as what should that number be, it should be multiples. And frankly, I think what we ought to do is target a few of these communities and say, we're going to change these communities around. And we're going to show them that this model works, because once you show success, it's easier to get more capital for things.
Mr. Falchuk?
I mean, I'm glad to hear Jeff talking about wanting to make sure more money is spent, because at the end of the day, that is what's needed, is more resources into many of these communities. There's probably at least $1 billion that needs to be spent to bring our educational spending right up towards where it needs to be if we reopen Chapter 70. And it's not strange, it's a strange coincidence, but that's how much they're going to spend on the convention center. I don't really laugh about turning garbage into gasoline. I think it's a perfectly good thing to do. I just don't think that's how we're going to plug our state budgetary needs, which are significant. They're really significant. And a lot of these things need to be targeted towards gateway cities. I don't think it's about bringing in everybody from the outside, because everybody's such a genius because they live in good communities that have not been faced with the struggles that so many gateway cities have. These are systematic problems. I've worked with a great CDC called Interez here, well, in Lawrence, nearby, working with small business owners in the community who are working to get ahead. And these are people, first generation immigrants. The fact that I speak Spanish allowed me to work with those folks closely, that are working hard to say, how do you take your very small business, it could be a laundromat, it could be a restaurant, it could be a small manufacturing company, and grow it and keep it stable. Not to turn it into a $100 million company, but just one of those seedlings that grows and sprouts and becomes the foundation. When you drive around parts of Lawrence, you can see them. That's one that's an Enterprise company. That's one that's another. The CDC model really works, but it cannot be done without looking at and saying we must fund education properly so that people within every community have the same chance to get ahead.
Thank you. Tom Zupa.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick, The market basket standoff is now in its 5th week. This affects 25,000 employees, consumers, and countless related businesses. How would you grade Governor Patrick's performance on this? And if you were governor today, at what point would you have stepped in?
Well, I was asked this very early on, would I step in? And I know the governor said he didn't think it was his role. Charlie Baker said the same thing. I actually did on NECN on a show, and I said absolutely, I would step in right away. And my rationale was, this is a very important company. It's not just about two guys with huge egos and a lot of money fighting about something. This is a lot of very dedicated employees, some of whom have worked there for decades. It is about all these small vendors. It is about the consumers who are accounting on this chain because of their pricing. So it's not just 25,000 people. I mean, it is a huge number of people that this affects. And by the way, there is an extraordinary amount of value and goodwill that is just evaporating day by day. So now you can't force yourself upon them in that situation, but I know all kinds of financial tools that you can use to try and drive people to an agreement. And remember, my whole life I've been working with small companies. Typically they have these very, very large, sometimes overbearing customers and, you know, Fortune 500 companies and partnerships and such. So I'm used to these dynamics that are difficult, and I think he should have, again, stepped in very, very early on. This is not just any company with a couple of cousins arguing about something.
Mr. Falchuk?
I'd give Governor Patrick about a C on this, and I know it's a little bit early to be giving out grades, but it's all right. I'm running for governor. I'm going to give him a C. And I'll tell you why. A few reasons. One of them is, yeah, the governor does have a role to play, especially given the importance of market basket. He early on was saying, I don't think I should step in, and was facing the trouble that he had stepped in other corporate disputes around union organizations, where he had encouraged state workers not to frequent hotels that were struggling with union organization. So you can't have it both ways. Say the governor doesn't have a role except when, right? That's not good. And I think the other one was one of disclosure, which again is part of my problem with the establishment, is that the governor's well-intentioned in this, and I don't think there's any underhanded dealings going on, but the truth is that his wife is a member of the law firm that represents the board on one side of the deal. And it's a fact, and I think disclosure would have helped if he had just said up front, look, by the way, there's nothing going on here, I just want you to know, and then people could look at it and they would know, but unfortunately it doesn't happen. And it is the kind of thing, because people hear about it and they say, oh, you know, this isn't right. And once again, the foundations of what it means for people to have trust and faith in our government get eroded away. Because I think that the governor may not be doing it just because he thinks it's the right thing to do. We need leaders that want to be transparent and open so people can know what they're about and what their deal is. And it's something that's been missing too often in our politics.
Any rebuttal? Okay, we'll move on to round 3, and Chris Camille.
An energy company is looking to build a pipeline that would carry natural gas from the New York border across the state to Drake it. Many homeowners and businesses are concerned about the impact it will have on their properties. Do you support the pipeline? And if you were governor, how would you handle negotiations with the company that's looking to build it?
I'm against the pipeline. I'm one of only 2 candidates that, up until I think yesterday, Martha Coakley suggested, or 2 days ago, that she might be against it too, but we've been pretty out front on this issue. I'm against it for a number of reasons. One of them is I don't think that natural gas production is our future. We need to be investing more in renewable energy and technologies. But the other one is really got to do with the process. And here's the hard, cold reality of this, and I say this as a person who cares a lot about this issue. I don't think there's a lot that the state is going to be able to do to stop that pipeline from being built. The federal government has the ability to take the land it wants to take at the behest of the company that's going to get it. I know that the legislature did not pass the tariff that would be an increase for ratepayers to support this, but I'm sure the cost will end up somehow coming out of ratepayers' pockets. The gas is going to be largely exported. So what we have going on is something we've become used to in America, which is a private for-profit company getting government to take private land to build something where it's going to make a lot of profit from this project, and the rest of us are left here with not much to show for it. Now, there will be some marginal benefit, of course, because there'll be some more gas coming through to help us with our tight supplies of gas. But this is not the way to handle the process. I was at the rally on this that was in Boston Common. My running mate was just out in Northfield at an event out there listening to the folks from Kinder Morgan explaining their position on this. It's very troubling to voters to find out that they can wake up one day and find that large swaths of land in their community are going to be taken to be given to a private company for this purpose, and there's been no effort at public consensus. One last thing on this. What's been very clear is that our state legislators and people from the executive branch, as well as people that are our federal representatives, have been aware of the fact that this pipeline was going to happen. The level of communication with people from our cities and towns has been incredibly bad. They just found out about it over the summer, and that's wrong. And it ought to be scandalous, whether the pipeline's built or not.
Mr.
You know,
McCormick?
it raises the question of who do these people work for?
Well, as I said, in looking at potential problems with things, we also look for solutions. So we actually have a company that ultimately you want to get this gas to communities, you want to get to, again, hospitals, colleges, industrial and commercial companies. So that's what we do, because they all have roads. And it's just another way of solving the problem and not having to build something that usually they amortize those things over 30 years. You know, that is essentially, you know, for our purposes, a permanent piece of infrastructure. So you don't have to do that, and that is what gets a lot of people concerned. You know, unfortunately, the volumes of solar and wind, they're just not there yet. And we look at hundreds of these companies. We know this well. We built the largest biodiesel company in North America, which is clean burning fuel. So we have to get there gradually. And if you truck it, you use it as a bridge fuel, which is great. You still get rid of the nastier stuff that's out there. It's cleaner. It's much healthier for people to work around, by the way. And you're ready for the next generation of technologies as some of these renewables have you know, better economics associated with them. So that's, to me, the smart solution to all this. And I do agree that the transparency has just been awful. So it's kind of like there's been a loaded deck here.
So are you for or against the pipeline?
I'm against the pipeline, but I do want to disclose that we saw this whole market developing the way it is. So we have a company that just trucks the fuel in.
So but again, I just want to make sure I'm clear. You're opposed to the pipeline. You think it should not be built?
Yeah, the pipeline I don't think should be built, and I think we should go with exactly what we're doing today.
Mr. Falchuk, the State House News Service story, I had a story yesterday in today's paper that said that natural gas prices are going to go up, that it's going to cost more for consumers to pay for their gas. So if we don't build a pipeline, and so what do you say to those consumers? Your governor now, natural gas prices, which a lot of people have now because they wanted to convert from oil. What do you tell them?
I tell them exactly this, which is that this is exactly the problem. We're already over-reliant on natural gas in Massachusetts. Over-reliant for energy generation, for home heating. So it means that when price spikes like this happen, and they will, make no mistake, everybody is now footing the bill for it. Someone's profiting on it, but these price spikes do happen. So the urgency of the need to transition our economy into one that's more resilient, more diverse from an energy perspective is really, now is the time. This pipeline ought to be a wake-up call. You know, when you're doing hydraulic fracturing, and I know the technology is there, it's sort of, you know, the back end of the fossil fuel-based economy when you start trying to figure out how do we scrape out the last amounts of this stuff. And it has created a profusion, an incredible amount of new discoveries of fossil fuels. But it just further kicks the can down the road, which is what we've been doing. So those consumers have to recognize the reality that we have state policy that is not geared towards comprehensively making our energy generation infrastructure more resilient, diversified, and distributed, which is what natural gas does not present to us.
Anything further?
Yeah, Evan, you can't forget about cost, though. That's the one thing. You know, it would be great if we could be 100% renewable, but if our energy costs went up tenfold, that would probably not be a good thing for anyone in Massachusetts. So you've got to look at both, and you've got to have the balance. And I think the problem with a lot of people with your mindset is you believe that all things are equal. They're not. And this isn't just a subtle kicking the can down the road. we have a 200-year supply. That's gonna outlive everyone in this room. We better figure out a way that, again, we can just use that as a bridge so that eventually all these great technical institutions, including those in this city, can come up with the technologies that we can make things economically feasible.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the mindset is that I have on this, other than saying we need to be distributed, resilient, and diverse in our energy supplies. I'm not proposing we should have a tenfold increase in our energy costs at all. I think that's wrong. But what I do note is that the state legislature kicked the can down the road on the solar energy tax credits that are required, for the net metering to help these things grow. They decided to just do a little bit, so that now it's going to have to be something that's dealt with in the future. The companies, to have scale in marketing and putting these things into place from a leverage perspective, can't do it if they don't have certainty that there's long-term supports for these renewable energy things.
Okay,
We have an
we're gonna-
obligation to do it.
We gotta move on. Maria?
Middlesex Community College, as well as the other community colleges in the Commonwealth, play a vital role in training and retraining the workforce. If you are elected governor, can you share some of ideas of how your administration would create access to employer partners and generate more collaboration between businesses and the community colleges in the Commonwealth?
I think partnering with business is imperative. When I talk to businesses around the Commonwealth, so many of them say, Jeff, for them, it's not an issue about jobs growth. It's an issue about having people that can fill those jobs. So just when you hear that, you say we have got to do a better job working directly with businesses to understand exactly what their needs are going to be going forward. And they know. If it's a robotics company, they know what they're going to be looking for if they're looking to grow in the future. We know we have certain areas just demographically. Think about the extraordinary numbers of people, baby boomers, that are going to be retiring, and just look at the demographic shifts in Massachusetts. So we know what a lot of those needs are going to be. I don't understand, quite frankly, why we can't put the colleges together and say, why are we graduating so many people in certain areas that there aren't jobs or won't be jobs? Because if someone is going to go through school, you want to know that there's a job at the other end. So workforce training and preparing people, and I will say this, I don't think you can do it early enough. I think you need to be talking to kids in elementary school about what all of this is for, and the fact that this is about ultimately being on your own, having a job, being successful, and have a chance at living the American dream. And that's something, again, you've got to have someone at the top constantly harping on that sort of issue to bring a public-private partnership together. And there are companies that want to do it, and by the way, Worcester's done it incredibly well, especially with their technical schools.
Yeah, community colleges, vocational schools, these are critical parts. Job training programs, these are critical parts of what it's going to take to help people grow and thrive in a modern workforce. Unfortunately, at the state level, even though there's a lot of great organizations doing these things, the state has not prioritized proper funding for these programs. I know it sounds like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but it's the reality. You go issue after issue, you're going to find people that are working on difficult, important issues that will tell you that we could do a bit better if we had a few million extra dollars from the government to support our initiatives. And I'm not talking about saying so we can have lavish types of accommodations and things. I'm talking about to be able to hire the people that it takes to train people, and it doesn't happen. The question becomes, given that the reality of what needs to be done is well understood, why is our establishment not doing it? Why isn't it doing it? So what I've been calling for in my campaign, and we do this every time we raise these issues, we need a fundamental reallocation of our state resources. There's $35-some billion in the state budget. There's a lot of that money that's being spent in ways that it should not, and it needs to be reallocated in ways that it should. Now, there's no reason why a tax break should go out to a company like Intel for a few $100 million to keep a factory open that it closed, when the money's not available for job training and to build these public-private partnerships to help companies that need workers find them. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it does when you start to follow the money and say, how does our political process work today? I get that. You get big influential companies, they can get a lot of things done. You get some folks that don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of clout, maybe don't look maybe aren't in the right class of people, they're not going to get it done. Well, it won't change until we vote to make it change, and that's why I'm running, and that's why I founded a new party.
Any rebuttal?
I would just add to that, one of them is talking about just follow the money. Wait till we really see what's going on with the casinos, when you want to follow the money and see why people take the positions they take.
Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
I would assume you agree with that. No,
Agree with the fact that you need to elaborate? Yes.
No, we've been reading about big money lining up behind other candidates, not Evan and myself, and I'm just saying that, you know, as a case in point, as he's saying, follow the money, and you'll see where people's allegiances are or how they change. We're going to see a lot of that.
All right, Tom Zupa.
Well, you mentioned Mr. McCormick Casino, so my question is.
I'm your setup guy. Go ahead.
Thank you. Are you satisfied with the casino licensing process? And how will you vote on the casino repeal question on the ballot in November?
I've gone on record many times saying I would vote to repeal the casinos. I think that casinos, net, are job killers. They certainly hurt local restaurants. They hurt the local arts community. A third of the revenues typically come in from addicted gamblers, and that's a problem. And I think the people's voices ought to be heard. As far as your question about the legislation and how it was put forward, I actually think they did some things backwards, and I think I think that the process could have been better. I also think that there have been times in the process that there appeared to be, again, a lack of transparency when conflicts of interest arose.
So the two questions were the licensing process and the ballot initiative.
Yes, thank you.
So I'll be voting against the repeal of the ballot initiative. And I think, by the way, the licensing process has not been very good at all. I think the conflicts between the chair and the groups he's been with he should have resigned. The reason I'm voting against it is this. We live in a democracy, and the legislature passed a law saying that there's a framework for how we'll decide whether we're going to have casinos in Massachusetts, and that will be left up to the cities and towns to vote on how they want to act. And the cities and towns voted. And as everybody knows, there were so many hard-fought battles in those cities and towns around this issue, and some communities said they wanted to have casinos, like in Springfield. Others said they did not. So that should be the end of it. What has become a problem in America today is that one side wins. I mean, for democracy to work, one side wins, one side loses, and then we go forward together. What's happened in America today is one side wins, the other side loses, and then it does what we've seen happen in Washington. You know, one side says, oh, well, you know what, maybe this law is just unconstitutional, we'll sue against it. How about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare? And then for the last 4 years, essentially, the federal government has been stuck because our democratic process isn't allowed to move forward. I worry about what will happen in the future of our country if we aren't able to, from a democratic perspective, just make decisions and move forward. And I think it is incumbent upon us as leaders to say, this decision was made, and it's time to move on.
Anything else? Any rebuttal?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is the people resisting this feel like the goalposts have been moved on them, and they have. So a fixed process has not been a fixed process. And that's why this one, I think, is just broken. But we certainly cannot manage the state going forward by referendum.
When did the goalposts move?
Well, after the initial votes and deadlines and everything else, they started to change the deadlines. They started moving deadlines back. So the people resisting this have a very, good argument.
I guess they moved the deadlines to. I'm not in the debate. I might not even.
Come on in.
I don't know if I should be in on this, but they moved the deadline to give communities more time, to give companies more time, to really to be more deliberative than.
Certainly, that's what they're claiming.
Okay. All right, let's go to round 4. We're doing well here on time. Chris Kamir.
All right, simple question. What do you think is the biggest waste of spending in state government?
Is that for me?
It is for Mr. McCormick.
whenever I travel the state, a common theme is the agencies just don't talk to each other. They just don't work with each other. They have their own kind of little fiefdoms, and there's so much administration within an agency or a program that if they could just coordinate their efforts in their goal of helping people, that there would be tremendous savings there. I'll tell you, as someone who has implemented a lot of technology in my life, I think about some of the scandals that we've had, the lab scandal, the DCF scandal, the EBT card scandal, obviously the $200 million wasted on the Health Connector website. Those are technical issues. They're technology issues. And if you think about a state that is one of the technology leaders, not just in the country, but in the world, you know, it seems to me like we have the resources around us. We just aren't listening to people who are not working with the right people. So I think there's tremendous savings just in the use and adaptation of technology. And I also think coordination among agencies is something that hopefully will come up with the kind of capital that we need to invest in early childhood education and invest in housing and invest in roads and bridges throughout the Commonwealth.
Oh, I could talk about this for a while. Big tax breaks to big companies that are politically connected. Hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, that are being spent on that. That would be my number one area of waste. There's also numerous programs like the convention center program I just talked about, where there's some politically connected pet project that's being done for reasons that aren't clear to most of the public. That's $1 billion. We have 416 structurally deficient roads and bridges in Massachusetts. One of them, just here on Route 3A the other day, a piece of it dropped off on someone's car. That was one of those 416 bridges. When there's a lot of stuff that the state government believes it's saving money on by doing deferred maintenance like that, which ultimately end up making things cost a heck of a lot more money. We have to be able to be smart and stop kicking the can down the road. At a certain point when you kick the can down the road, the can hits the wall, bounces back. Maybe it bounces up and hits you in the face. Or maybe it falls off of a structurally deficient bridge and smashes your car window. You know, this is what's wrong, is we can't have these very specific conversations about where should the money be going because we get stuck in this endless left-right debate, in the vague platitudes, when there's real issues going on. And you know, when I meet voters across the Commonwealth, and I meet voters in lots of situations outside of supermarkets in their homes, knocking on doors, calling them, they don't say there's particular programs, sometimes they do, that they're upset about, but what they really say is, I'm worried because our government doesn't function properly. I'm worried because I feel as if my voice doesn't matter. I'm concerned because I don't know how it's going to be, how it's going to get better, because I don't see anything coming that's going to change anything. That's the most serious underlying problem that we have. Without solving that, these issues, you'll always be patted on the head. Oh, we did something about it this year. We put a few million extra dollars in there. Isn't that good enough? Could have been worse. That's not leadership.
Anything else? Okay, Maria?
Yes. As an immigrant and a product of the American dream, I fear that my children and many other young people in the Commonwealth, burdened with college loans, aren't able to fulfill their dream of owning a home. What are some of the initiatives that you propose to make this a reality for them?
The plan that we put out called the Thriving Communities Action Plan is all about kickstarting housing production. And we really need this. Make no mistake about this. There have been studies going back to the early 2000s that show we need at least 10,000 additional units of multifamily housing in Massachusetts every single year to keep up with current demand. 10,000 in addition to what has been built. 10,000. That's so that young people can afford to own homes. There's so many young people you talk to, as you point out, that the idea of home ownership is sort of like, yeah, right. How's that ever going to happen? We have never had, in the years that this has been known, any kind of comprehensive state housing production policy. None. We have nice words. Governor Patrick has said, hey, we need to build 10,000 new units, just like I just did. But then they walked it back and they said, well, just 10,000. Not 10,000 in addition, 10,000. But no plan. There was a law, there was a bill in the legislature to change zoning laws, which are really old. And advocates in this area will tell you that law was going to bring them up to the 1980s. It's kind of cool to get up to the 1980s. 80s were good in some ways, right? Van Halen. I mean, you know, but they're trying to update just the 1980s. It didn't pass. They've been trying to do this for more than a decade. It didn't pass. So the cost of living keeps going up, and it's affecting people at the lower end of the income scale. It's affecting young people. It's affecting older people who are living in homes that they want to be able to sell or maybe move to some place that's smaller. And right now, if you were to say, hey, let's design a policy that will make Massachusetts have fewer young people in it, have older people living closer to poverty, have middle income people be put at greater risk, you'd have a set of policies just like we have right now. That's
Mr.
got to
McCormick?
change.
Well, as far as embracing an immigrant population to begin with, 61% of the new companies formed in Massachusetts are by first-generation immigrants. We have hundreds of immigrants in our different portfolio companies doing all kinds of different jobs. And so we need to recognize that we absolutely positively, thank you,
Sure.
need to embrace the immigrant population. Both of us, we're descendants of immigrants. It's whether you're second generation or first or fifth, that's what we're made of. So to me, this is not just an immigrant issue. I mean, this is an issue for all kinds of young people. I had to save until I was 39 years old before I could buy my first piece of real estate. That's how expensive, Massachusetts was compared to where I came from. I mean, that's a long time for a lot of people. So I certainly understand the issue, and it is about allowing, especially with the millennials now, because there is a movement to re-urbanize, which is actually a very good thing. So you can have denser housing, you can have walkable cities. It's easier on mass transportation issues as well when they're denser populations. And we just have to push in that direction. And the legislature can't keep dragging their feet on it. I mean, that's just all there is to it, because it's where society wants to go.
Yeah, and one other part of this is think about the creative arts, because in places like Lowell, where neighborhoods have become gentrified and rebuilt because people have provided creative spaces for people to come, these are really good things, and artists tend to be the pioneers that move into these places in the first place. There isn't much support from the state to make sure that these things are part of a comprehensive plan for housing, because there's existing structures, old mill buildings that have been, many of them repurposed, but the financing has to be there, and the state tax credits. Many of these deals have to have a dozen or more tax credits to make them economically viable. But this is what it means to not have a comprehensive housing production policy, and it has real world consequences. So when I encourage voters that they've got to vote, and I know that everybody here will be voting, but for those that are listening on Twitter and on all these cameras, vote, because it matters. This affects your life. This affects every single one of us. When our state does not have policies in place to make sure people can afford to live here, they won't be able to afford to live here, or those with money will. That's exactly the opposite of what America is supposed to be about.
Tom Zupa.
Question 4.
Question for Mr. McCormick.
Okay. Mr. McCormick, next year the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education will vote on a statewide test for all of its students. What's your philosophy on high-stakes testing?
Being on the board of an education company that I had mentioned earlier, with some world-class people nationally, I will tell you there's a lot of question at the board level about testing and a lot of issues regarding over-testing. I do think that we need testing. I don't think it should be summarily abandoned. However, I'm a strong believer, and largely because of my working on this board for many years, that we need to figure out ways to empower teachers better than we are. A great teacher is the #1 indicator of whether or not someone's going to have a good education. It is about the teachers. And there is a certain element where there's just over-testing, and there's just too much time and too much emphasis on the tests and too much time being spent teaching kids to the test instead of teaching them how to think and how to be courageous and how to be leaders and how to be resilient, how to fail and come back. Those are the most important lessons, not just how you did on one specific test. And there has to be a balance. And quite frankly, I don't think there is a balance right now. And I'll tell you, just for the sake of this conversation, on our board, and these are some of the best, there's a real debate about the Common Core. And there's some pluses and minuses with that as well. So I don't think we have, as a society, figured that one out well.
Yeah, look, my wife Felicia and I have 3 kids who are in the public schools near our home. They're 14, 11, and 7. They've taken the existing standardized tests. It becomes a big part of the school year. You know, when you got your daughter coming home saying, I know I'm only learning this particular kind of math because of the test, you say, you know, we're raising young cynics. It's not good. Like, it's okay to be 44 and be a little cynical, but not 14. No, not too much. But you know, it comes down to the way we fund education, and to deal with and to do the things that we're talking about here requires more money for education. Chapter 70, which is the major way in which education is funded, was created in 1993. It was supposed to be updated every 2 years to reflect the changing realities of educating kids. It's been updated twice since 1993. The last time was 10 years ago. There was an effort in the legislature this year to reopen that and say, let's figure out how to modernize this given the realities of educating kids in the second decade of the 21st century. It didn't happen, and the legislature, one of the legislators said, it was hard. To which I say, get an easier job. This is too important. So what I've called for in very specific terms in this campaign is to not just reopen that so that we can make sure that the money is being reallocated from the state properly towards these priorities. It's going to take some real money, because this is falling on the backs of cities and towns. But also to say, what does our educational system look like in 20 years? And how do we work back from that to make sure that's what's going on in our schools? There will be standardized testing. It's part of the reality of where the money is flowing from. It will have its negative aspects, it will have its positive aspects. I can tell you, and there are communities that are especially troubled where at least having a standardized test allows having some kind of standard that they can work towards, and to make sure that funding follows in those directions. But it's in the best interest of everybody. It improves the well-being of everybody in the Commonwealth if we can make sure that every child gets the best possible education. So it's not just something that, boy, it feels good to do. This is a great investment in our future, and our leaders aren't up to the task.
Rebuttal?
Yeah, just one global comment. It's almost always wise to measure things. In healthcare, measure outcomes. In education, you know, measure performance. But again, it's not the only barometer. The one area that you find very little measurement is government. They're not constantly measuring their own outcomes, saying this worked, this didn't, let's do more of this and let's not do that again. Why? Because it's so political that they almost don't want to know the answers.
I just want to add to this, because this is one of the challenges, because Jeff has recently proposed that we've got to cut the state income tax in a world in which, as you've pointed out in numerous ways, we need more money to go to these programs. You've said you want to make sure, I guess it's through attrition, that 5,000 jobs at the state level go away. So there's a mismatch between the things that you're saying about the need to do these things and with the policies that you're proposing during this job interview. They don't match up.
Well, actually they do, because if it's through attrition, natural attrition, it's as people are leaving, because we know there's so much waste within a number of agencies. But we also know there's many other ways of saving hundreds of millions of dollars within just the way government runs, which can go into these other programs.
But so attrition is sort of, I mean, it's just people, when they leave, so we don't know where they're going to leave from or how. So it's sort of like it'll work itself out, which isn't really, to me, a very good business strategy. But think about what's happened over the last decade. And yes, there's been more people hired in state government, which you pointed out. Department of Mental Health has lost 1,000 jobs. Developmental Services lost 1,000 jobs. Military Division, including our National Guard, has needs. Department of State Police has lost 200 jobs. Victim and Witness Assistance. If people leave those departments, are you saying don't replace the people at the State Police, Victim and Witness Assistance, Developmental Services, Mental Health?
No, I'm not saying
plan?
don't replace any job, because in fact, when I came out with a statement, I said clearly there are going to be some jobs that need to be replaced. But there are very definitely jobs that don't need to be replaced.
So which?
Were you around for any of the probation department, hearings?
So which jobs?
Did you hear about, specifically, did you hear about how those people are hired? And the fact that jobs are political currency.
Right.
You've got to understand that. So if you
which
can create
jobs?
10,000 jobs.
If the Developmental Services Department is down 1,000, in other words, they need more. Do you want to hire more in that department or not?
If they need to be hired in that department, they need to be hired in that department.
And Department of Mental Health, Health and Human Services, these are Elder Affairs, Veterans Affairs, these are all the things that don't get funded. that you're saying, well, by attrition, we'll save all this money. This isn't a strategy.
Well, okay, so I can tell you right now, in DCF, there's a way of finding 20% more time for everyone by changing a regulation.
But then by attrition, you'll get the right number of DCF employees. I mean, you got to be able to
So-
say, these are the people I'm going to take out, and these are the ones I want to keep.
Which
DCF
I
is
will be
actually,
able to say, having run
DC
as many companies as I have,
Yeah.
I'll be able to say that, and I'll be able to use technology.
DCF is actually down 55 employees during the course of the Patrick administration. So, you know, again, when you look at these things, the numbers just, they don't add up. I mean, they just don't add up, and voters have a right to expect that if you're going to lay that kind of a plan out. It can't just be, oh, well, the employees will just leave. I mean, what do you do if 50 people don't like the new technology at DCF, or if a bunch of people in mental health decide they can get a better job somewhere else, or if a number of police officers decide to retire because the timing's right? I mean, this isn't really a plan so much as it is a nice, it's what we've come used to. It's like a political stunt. You get the likes on Facebook, but it's not a real plan. And that's what we need, and that's what makes voters so dispirited by our political process. It's, hey, we'll cut taxes. And then people say, yeah, cut taxes. Let's go cut taxes. Rather than saying, what's our real plan to solve the serious problems we face? That's what's missing.
Last comment.
Yeah, I think you can right-size government, and I've done it in companies, and I don't think most people believe that government runs as efficiently as it should, and most people don't know where those 10,000 jobs went, and
Well, it's here. I can show you, because the state comptroller has a nice website that you can go to, and it actually lists. You can go and you could put in 2007 and 2014, and you could see exactly department by department how many jobs.
Yeah, but we don't know what they're doing, is my point.
Well, you can drill down even further. Actually, I know you can't get down to the level of each individual, but,
Right. Well,
but what I'm saying
that's
is,
the whole point, though. This is
well,
why
then
I
how can you
did this.
propose that 5,000 jobs could be eliminated? And you say that the information is not available. I'm holding it. I mean, I'm happy to. I guess I could tell you the URL, but you can find it.
Okay, gentlemen.
Yeah.
I think you both made your points on that subject, and and that concludes the question and answer portion of the debate. Thank you very much, panelists. We will now move on to a 2-minute closing statement from each candidate, and we'll begin, because we began with Mr. Falchuk on the questions, we'll begin with Mr. McCormick, please.
I entered this race because after having essentially lived the American dream, 52 years old, I said, how can I put back? And my wife Christine and I said, you know, this is an opportunity to affect millions of people. Having worked again to save money in energy, having worked in healthcare, having worked in education, having worked in biotechnology to try and help hundreds of millions of people actually in that space, it is time for someone who knows how to solve problems and get into an office and get into the detail and actually fix things. And for me, this has been a terrific experience thus far. People want someone who, you know, is self-made, who has actually created a lot of jobs, who actually has solved problems, who is not tied to special interests of the status quo. And it helps the fact that, you know, I just have very kind of modest roots, so I can just relate to people. I want to give people a choice. I want to give people a real voice. And I want to put the people before the politics.
First of all, thank you for hosting this debate and for the opportunity to present. I hope we get many more opportunities like this over the course of the campaign. This is a really important election, and the reason I'm in it is because I'm a voter who has become tired of an establishment that I don't believe takes people seriously. I don't think it treats people seriously. I don't think it's going to change until we don't just go and elect another governor, another person who says, hey, I'm better than everybody else, but rather that we create a new framework to have all kinds of new independent people enter into our political process, and to finally break free of the tired old left-right, Democrat versus Republican debates. The United Independent Party, which I founded, is based on some very simple ideas. It's that everybody is equal, everybody's civil rights have to be protected, and the government must spend taxpayer dollars wisely. And they are taxpayer dollars. This is what's needed in our politics, because most voters will tell you, yeah, I agree with that. But they'll also tell you they don't think the establishment represents that anymore. It will only change when we vote to make it change. So yes, I grew up here in Massachusetts. I've been a business person. We grew a healthcare company. I was the president of from 9 employees to up over 600. My wife Felicia is getting her master's in social work. My grandfather emigrated from Russia to Cuba and then to Venezuela. He was fleeing. He would have been classified probably as a migrant child. He was turned away from this country. Ended up in Venezuela, built a business, lived to be 101. And his story is one of the great inspirations of my life. But he sent my father to come live in this country. He was able to be successful and do these things because of what we have had in America. So much of that promise is not available to others. It must come back, and it will come back when we, the voters, vote to make it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, candidates. That concludes our debate of the independent candidates for governor. We thank candidates, our panel, and our audience. And the candidates will be available after in the lobby if you have a follow-up question for them, and I'm sure they'll spend some time. We're going to be clearing the room, and we're going to take a break until 3 p.m. when Sun editor Jim Campanini takes over my spot to moderate the debate between Republican gubernatorial candidates Charlie Baker and Mark Fisher. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, John.